My name is Sarah, and I'm what you might call a reluctant inheritor. My Aunt Megan, my mother's sister, passed away a few months ago and left me her entire estate. It wasn't much, a small rundown farmhouse in rural Alabama, a few acres of overgrown land, and a lifetime's worth of, well, junk, mostly. Megan was a bit of a hoarder, and a deeply religious one at that. The house was crammed with religious paraphernalia, crosses, icons, stacks of Bibles, and handwritten prayers taped to every available surface. I'm not particularly religious myself, so the whole atmosphere felt oppressive and unsettling. But family is family, and I felt obligated to sort through Megan's belongings, decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to, well, burn. The farm itself was located way out in the boondocks, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woods and dominated by a massive ancient oak tree in the front yard. That tree gave me the creeps. It just loomed. I planned to spend a week at the farm sorting through everything. My husband, Tom, couldn't get time off work, so I was on my own. I figured it would be a quiet, if somewhat depressing week. I was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. The whole thing started with the Bible. The first day was spent mostly clearing out the living room, which was piled high with boxes, newspapers, and religious tracts. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew, and the silence of the house was broken only by the creaking of the floorboards and the occasional buzz of a fly. Late in the afternoon, I decided to tackle the area around the fireplace. A large, stone monstrosity that dominated one wall of the living room. Behind a stack of dusty hymnals, I found a small, leather-bound book. It was a pocket Bible, worn and faded, with several pages missing. The leather was cracked and dry, and the gold lettering on the spine was barely visible. Curiosity piqued, I opened the Bible. The pages were thin and brittle, yellowed with age. I flipped through it, noticing that several passages were underlined in faded red ink. It felt strangely personal, holding this object that had clearly been so important to my aunt. Then I noticed something odd. On the inside of the back cover, there were some words scribbled in faint, spidery handwriting. It looked like a list of rules. Rule 1. Do not read aloud from this Bible after sunset. Rule 2. Keep the Bible closed and secured when not in use. Rule 3. Do not remove any pages from this Bible. More were missing than when I first looked. Rule 4. If you hear whispers, ignore them. Do not engage. Rule 5. If the room grows cold, pray silently until it warms. Rule 6. Never leave the Bible under the oak tree after dark. I frowned. This was strange, even for Megan. I knew she was deeply religious, bordering on superstitious, but this seemed excessive. It felt like something out of a horror movie. I shook my head, dismissing it as the eccentricity of an old woman. I placed the Bible on the mantelpiece, intending to put it aside with the other things I'd planned to keep. I had no intention of reading from it, aloud or otherwise. As evening approached, I made myself a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. The electricity was still working, thankfully, but the house felt cold and drafty, despite the warm Alabama air outside. I ate quickly, feeling increasingly uneasy. The silence of the house was starting to get to me. After dinner, I decided to take a walk around the property, hoping to clear my head. As I stepped outside, I was immediately struck by the size of the oak tree. It was even more imposing up close, its massive trunk and gnarled branches reaching up towards the darkening sky like skeletal fingers. There was something unsettling about it. I noticed something at the base of the tree, a dark, charred area on the ground, as if something had been burned there. It looked old, but the scorched earth was still visible. I remembered the line on the chart. Found burned under an old oak tree. I quickly walked away from the tree, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I walked around the perimeter of the property, taking in the overgrown fields and the encroaching woods. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. As I headed back towards the house, I heard a noise. A faint whispering sound like someone speaking just out of earshot. I stopped, listening intently. The whispering continued, seeming to come from all around me. Rule number 4: if you hear whispers, ignore them. Do not engage. I tried to dismiss it as the wind rustling through the trees, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like voices. I quickened my pace, almost running back to the house. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it securely. I leaned against the door, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was being ridiculous, I told myself. It was just the wind, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I looked over at the Bible on the mantel. I had left it open. The sight of the open Bible on the mantelpiece sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I had specifically remembered placing it there closed. Had I imagined that? Was I already losing my mind after only one day in this creepy house? I cautiously approached the fireplace, my eyes fixed on the Bible. As I got closer, I could hear the whispering again, fainter now, but definitely there. It seemed to be emanating from the book itself. I reached out, my hand trembling, and snapped the Bible shut. The whispering stopped instantly. The silence that followed was almost deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed Bible, trying to calm my racing pulse. I told myself, again, that I was being irrational. It was just an old book. A collection of stories. Nothing to be afraid of. But the feeling of unease persisted. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something wrong, that I had somehow triggered something by opening that Bible. I glanced at the rules scribbled on the back. Rule number 2: keep the Bible closed and secured when not in use. I hadn't secured it, but I had closed it. Was that enough? I decided to find something to secure it with. I rummaged through a drawer in a nearby table and found a length of twine. I carefully wrapped the twine around the Bible, tying it tightly shut. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a medieval ritual, but it made me feel slightly better. The rest of the evening was spent in a state of heightened anxiety. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, made me jump. I kept the lights on, even though it felt wasteful, and I avoided looking at the Bible on the mantelpiece. I tried to distract myself by reading a book I had brought with me, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept returning to the whispering, to the charred earth under the oak tree, to the strange rules in the Bible. Around 10 p.m., I decided to go to bed. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and I hoped that sleep would bring some relief from the growing sense of dread. The bedroom was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a rickety dresser, and a small window that looked out onto the backyard. I quickly changed into my pajamas, brushed my teeth, and climbed into bed. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it whistling through the gaps in the window frame. The branches of the oak tree scraped against the side of the house, a constant rhythmic scratching that set my teeth on edge. Then I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature. The room became noticeably colder, a chill that seeped into my bones. Rule number 5: if the room grows cold, pray silently until it warms. I closed my eyes and started to pray. I'm not particularly religious, as I mentioned, but I remembered the Lord's Prayer from my childhood, and I recited it silently, over and over, clinging to the words like a lifeline. The cold persisted. It felt like I was lying in a freezer, my teeth chattering, my body shivering uncontrollably. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, but it was no use. The cold was coming from within, from the very air around me. Then, I heard the whispering again. Faint, barely audible, but definitely there. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, near the dresser. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, continuing to pray, my voice a silent, desperate plea. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and I could almost make out words. It sounded like Latin. I felt a presence in the room, a cold, heavy presence that pressed down on me. I could feel its eyes on me, watching me, even though I couldn't see it. Terror gripped me, a primal, overwhelming fear that paralyzed me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of whatever was in the room with me. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the cold vanished. The whispering stopped. The presence lifted. I lay there gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. I slowly opened my eyes, expecting to see something. But the room was empty. The only sound was the wind whistling outside. My watch showed midnight. I had been lying there, frozen in terror, for 2 hours. 2 hours that felt like an eternity. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, not after that. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking menace. Every creak of the house sounded like approaching footsteps. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The Latin whispering. What did it mean? Was it connected to the Bible? To Megan? I finally got out of bed as the first hint of dawn lightened the sky. I felt drained, exhausted, but also strangely wired, my nerves on high alert. I needed coffee, strong coffee. I made my way to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The house felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, but the memory of the night's terrors was still fresh in my mind. As I was waiting for the coffee to brew, I noticed something on the kitchen table. It was the pocket Bible. My heart skipped a beat. I had left it on the mantelpiece, securely tied with twine. How had it gotten here? I cautiously approached the table, my eyes fixed on the Bible. The twine was gone. The book lay open, face down, on the table. I slowly reached out and picked it up. The pages were thin and brittle under my fingers. I turned it over and saw that it was open to a passage in the book of Revelation. The verses were underlined in red ink, the same faded ink as the rules on the back cover. I felt a sudden urge to read the passage aloud. It was a strange, compelling urge, almost irresistible. I knew I shouldn't. Rule number 1. Do not read aloud from this Bible after sunset. But it was morning now. The sun was up. It should be safe, right? My voice trembled as I began to read, the words echoing in the quiet kitchen. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard, as it were, the noise of thunder, one of the 4 beasts saying, "Come and see." And I saw, and behold, a white horse. And he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him. And he went forth one conquering, and to conquer. The fleeting glimpse of the figure outside the window sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to get out of the kitchen, out of the house, anywhere but here. I stumbled towards the living room, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. I glanced at the fireplace, where I had left the Bible the night before. It was gone. Of course it was. It was on the kitchen table. My mind was playing tricks with me, making me doubt my own sanity. As I reached the front door, I heard a noise behind me. A slow, deliberate creaking sound. like someone walking across the floorboards. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. I slowly turned around, my heart in my throat. Standing in the doorway of the kitchen was a figure, tall and gaunt, shrouded in shadow. It was the same figure I had seen in the woods, the same figure I had glimpsed outside the window. But this time, it was inside the house. I couldn't make out its features, but I could sense its presence, its cold, malevolent gaze. It was as if the shadows themselves had coalesced into a human form. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was constricted, my vocal cords paralyzed with fear. The figure slowly raised a hand, its long skeletal fingers pointing towards me. And then, I heard the voice again, the guttural whisper echoing through the room. "You have awakened him." The voice wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere. It was the same voice that had echoed my reading from the Bible, the same voice that had whispered in Latin. "You have broken the seals." The figure took a step towards me, its movement slow and deliberate. I could feel its cold presence, its oppressive weight, bearing down on me. I fumbled with the doorknob, my fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. I finally managed to turn it and yank the door open. I stumbled out onto the porch, into the bright morning sunlight. The sudden change from the darkness of the house to the brightness outside was disorienting. I looked back at the house, expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway. But it was gone. The house was silent, still. I didn't stop to question it. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, away from the house, towards the woods. I knew it was probably the worst place to go, but I couldn't think straight. I just needed to get away. As I ran, I could hear the voice again, whispering in my ear, its tone mocking, taunting. "You cannot escape. He is coming." I tripped over a root, sprawling onto the ground, the same way I had the night before. But this time, I didn't have a flashlight. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my body bruised and aching. I looked up at the sky, the bright blue sky, the fluffy white clouds. It was such a beautiful day, so peaceful, and yet I was trapped in the nightmare. I forced myself to get up, my legs trembling. I had to keep moving. I had to find somewhere to hide, somewhere to think. I remembered the old barn, located a short distance from the house, down a narrow, overgrown path. It was dilapidated, probably unsafe, but it was the only other structure on the property. I started walking towards the barn, my pace slow and cautious. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure pursuing me. But there was nothing there, just the trees, the fields, the silent, watchful house. The path to the barn was overgrown, choked with weeds and thorny bushes. I pushed my way through, ignoring the scratches on my arms and legs. The barn itself was a sorry sight, its wooden walls weathered and warped, its roof sagging in places. Several boards were missing, leaving gaping holes that revealed the darkness within. I hesitated at the entrance, peering inside. It was dim and dusty, the air thick with the smell of decay and animal droppings. I could hear the rustling of unseen creatures, the cooing of pigeons in the rafters. It wasn't exactly an inviting place, but it was better than being out in the open, exposed to whatever was out there. I stepped inside, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The barn was filled with old farm equipment, rusty tools, and stacks of rotting hay. Cobwebs hung like macabre decorations from the rafters, and dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the holes in the walls. I found a relatively clear spot near the back of the barn, behind a large, overturned wagon. I sank down onto the dirt floor, my back against the rough wood, and tried to catch my breath. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. My body ached, my head throbbed. and my mind was reeling. I needed to think, to make a plan, but I couldn't seem to focus. The terror was still too raw, too overwhelming. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the images, the sounds, the whispers. But it was no use. They were inside me now, a part of me. Then I remembered something. Something from the outline. Something about Megan's past. And the Bible. The Bible belonged to a preacher who was lynched under the tree. The oak tree. The massive, ancient oak tree in front of the house. The tree with the charred earth at its base. The tree I felt a strange draw to in the last section. A new wave of fear washed over me, colder and more profound than anything I had felt before. It wasn't just a random haunting. It wasn't just some demonic entity. It was something personal. Something connected to Megan, to the farm, to the Bible. I opened my eyes and looked around the barn, searching for something. I didn't know what. A clue. A sign. Anything that could help me understand what was happening. My gaze fell upon a small wooden chest tucked away in a corner, partially hidden by a pile of burlap sacks. It looked old, very old, its wood cracked and weathered, its metal hinges rusted. I felt a strange pull towards the chest, a sense of recognition. It was similar to the feeling I had experienced with the oak tree, a feeling that this object held some significance, some key to unlocking the mystery. I crawled over to the chest, my heart pounding. I reached out and lifted the lid. It creaked open, revealing the contents within. Inside, I found a collection of old letters, yellowed photographs, and newspaper clippings. I carefully lifted them out, my hands trembling. The letters were addressed to Megan, from various people, mostly family members. The photographs were mostly of Megan, at different ages, some with other people I didn't recognize. But it was the newspaper clippings that caught my attention. They were old, brittle, and faded, but I could still make out the headlines. Local preacher lynched by mob, one headline screamed, accused of heresy and witchcraft. My blood ran cold. I read the article, my eyes scanning the text frantically. It described the lynching of a preacher named Reverend Elijah Croft, who had been accused of practicing dark magic and corrupting the local community. He had been hanged from the oak tree in front of his house, his body burned afterwards. The house, the farm, it was this place. This was where the lynching had happened. And the Bible, the pocket Bible, it must have belonged to him. I looked at the other clippings. They detailed the aftermath of the lynching, the trials of the mob members, the controversy surrounding the event. And then I found one that made my heart stop. It was a small, almost insignificant article, tucked away at the bottom of the page. It described the discovery of a strange list of rules found scribbled on the back cover of Reverend Croft's Bible. Rules that were meant to contain his spirit. The rules, they were the same rules I had found in the pocket Bible, the same rules I had broken. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had unleashed the spirit of a vengeful preacher, a man who had been brutally murdered and unjustly accused. And now he was back. He was the whispers, the cold, the figure in the shadows. He was the one who had been haunting me, tormenting me. And he was using Megan's Bible, his Bible, as a conduit. But why me? What did he want? The outline provided the terrifying answer. And breaking the rules lets his spirit possess Megan to continue his revenge. Megan. The spirit hadn't just returned, it had a target. And it had used Megan before. The missing pages, the added rule in the list referencing not leaving the Bible under the tree after dark. Megan must have discovered and broken some of the rules herself years ago. The charred spot I saw under the tree, she had likely tried to destroy the Bible. But it didn't work. it only angered the spirit further. And now I had repeated her mistakes, amplifying the preacher's power and making myself a target. The possession part, was that what was happening? Was that the goal? Was I to be the vessel for his revenge? I looked down at the newspaper clippings again, my eyes scanning the articles for any clue, any hint of what Reverend Croft's revenge might entail. I found a recurring theme: fire. He was accused of using fire in his dark rituals. The mob had burned his body after lynching him, and Megan had tried to burn the book. Fire. Was that the key? Was that what he wanted? To burn everything down? To destroy the farm, the community, everything that had wronged him? Then I heard it. A crackling sound coming from outside the barn. It was a faint sound at first, but it grew quickly, becoming louder and more distinct. I knew what it was, even before I looked. I crawled to the entrance of the barn and peered out. The house was on fire. Flames were leaping from the windows, licking at the roof, consuming the wooden structure with terrifying speed. The smoke billowed into the sky, a dark, ominous cloud that blotted out the sun. It had started. His revenge. I watched in horror, my mind numb, my body frozen. I should have been running, trying to escape, but I couldn't move. I was mesmerized by the inferno, by the sheer destructive power of it. Then, I saw him. Standing in front of the burning house, silhouetted against the flames, was the figure. Tall and gaunt, its features still obscured by shadow, but its presence undeniable. It was Reverend Croft, or at least his spirit. He was watching the fire, his arms raised towards the sky, as if in supplication, or triumph. And then, I heard the voice again, the guttural whisper, but it was different this time. It was stronger, clearer, filled with a chilling satisfaction. Vengeance. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the air, all around me, carried on the wind, echoing through the crackling flames. The figure turned its head, slowly, and looked directly at me. Even though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze, its cold, malevolent gaze, piercing through me. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was next. The fire was just the beginning. His revenge wouldn't be complete until he had destroyed me, too. I stumbled back into the barn, away from the burning house, away from the figure, away from the terrifying reality of what I had unleashed. Panic clawed at my throat, a desperate urge to flee overwhelming me. But where could I go? He was everywhere. The burning house was a beacon, a testament to his power. The woods offered no solace, only the memory of his lurking presence. I scrambled back to the chest, my mind racing. The letters, the photos, they were useless. But the Bible, Croft's Bible, it was the key somehow. I had to destroy it. Properly. Not like Megan's failed attempt. But how? Fire was his element, his weapon. Burning it wouldn't work. It might even empower him further. Water? I had no access to a significant amount of water, not enough to destroy a book so thoroughly. Burying it. He'd already been buried under that cursed oak. That wouldn't stop him. Then I remembered something else from my frantic research after the first night. Superstitions about dealing with vengeful spirits. Salt, iron, holy symbols. Iron. The barn was full of old farm equipment, rusty tools. There had to be something I could use. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the dim interior of the barn. I spotted a pile of rusty metal objects near the back wall. I rushed over, my heart pounding, and started digging through the pile. Horseshoes, broken plowshares, twisted lengths of wire. And then, I found it. A heavy iron stake, used for tethering animals. It was long and sharp, its point still relatively intact, despite the rust. It was perfect. I grabbed the stake, its weight surprisingly comforting in my hand. I knew what I had to do. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance I had. I had to drive the stake through the Bible, pin it down, neutralize its power. I went back to the spot where I'd been sitting, my eyes searching for the Bible I'd dropped in my earlier fear. It should be there. It had to be. It wasn't. Panic flared again, hotter and more intense than before. Where was it? Had he taken it? Was it too late? Then, I saw it. Not on the floor, but resting on top of the overturned wagon, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately. Open. And facing the page, with the underlying passage from Revelation. The same passage I had read aloud. The passage that had awakened him. I knew it was a trap. He wanted me to come closer. He wanted me to touch the Bible again, but I had no choice. I approached the wagon slowly, cautiously, the iron stake held tightly in my hand. The air around the Bible seemed to shimmer, to vibrate with an unseen energy. I could feel the cold presence, stronger now than ever before. I reached out, my hand trembling, and grabbed the Bible. The moment my fingers touched the leather cover, I felt a jolt of energy, like an electric shock, that ran up my arm and through my body. I gasped, my vision blurring. I could hear the whispering again, louder now, a chorus of voices, speaking in Latin, in English, in a language I didn't understand. I saw the figure again, not outside, but in my mind's eye, clearer now, more defined. I could see his face, or what was left of it. A skeletal face with empty eye sockets and a gaping, lipless mouth. A face filled with rage and hatred. He was reaching for me, his skeletal hands outstretched, his fingers closing around my throat. I raised the iron stake, my arm shaking, and with all my remaining strength, I brought it down. The stake pierced the Bible, pinning it to the wooden surface of the wagon. A deafening scream echoed through the barn, a scream that was both human and inhuman, filled with pain and fury. The air crackled with energy, the barn shook, and the whispering intensified, reaching a crescendo before abruptly cutting off. Then, silence. The cold presence was gone. The figure in my mind's eye vanished. The burning house outside. I could still hear the crackling of the flames, but it seemed distant now, less threatening. I stood there, panting, the iron stake still clutched in my hand, the Bible impaled beneath it. I didn't know if it had worked. I didn't know if I was safe. But for the first time since that first night, I felt a glimmer of hope. A fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. I stayed in the barn until the fire burned itself out, leaving the farmhouse a smoldering ruin. I didn't dare approach it. I didn't dare remove the stake from the Bible. I just waited, watching, listening, praying that it was truly over. As the sun began to set, I finally left the barn. I walked away from the farm, away from the cursed oak tree, away from the ashes of what had once been my aunt's home. I didn't look back. I walked for miles, until I reached the nearest town. I called Tom, my voice shaking, and told him a version of what had happened. I told him about the fire, about the old Bible, about the strange feelings I had experienced. I didn't tell him about the whispers, the figure, the preacher's spirit. I knew he wouldn't believe me. He would think I was crazy. He drove out to get me, his face etched with worry and confusion. He took me home, and I tried to return to my normal life. But it was impossible. The nightmares continued. The fear lingered. I saw shadows everywhere, heard whispers in the wind. I jumped at every creak, every unexpected noise. I never told anyone the full truth about what happened at the farm. I knew they wouldn't understand. They would think I was insane. I did, however, do some more research. I found out more about Reverend Elijah Croft, the preacher who had been lynched. He had been a controversial figure, even before the accusations of witchcraft. He had preached a fire and brimstone gospel, condemning sin and warning of the coming apocalypse. He had alienated many in the community, and his death had been convenient for some. I also learned more about the history of the farm itself. It had been in Megan's family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter. And there were stories, whispers, of other strange occurrences, other tragedies that had happened on that land. It seemed that the farm was cursed, a place where darkness lingered, where the veil between worlds was thin, and I had unwittingly stumbled into the middle of it. Years have passed, and the physical scars have healed. But the emotional scars remain. I still jump at shadows. I still avoid old Bibles. And I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I often wonder about the Bible, still pinned to the wagon in that dilapidated barn. Is it still there? Is the spirit of Reverend Croft truly contained? Or is he just waiting? Waiting for someone else to break the rules?